said that you became aware of the Chemical Valley around Sarnia when you studied at the University of Western Ontario in London. What made that situation stand out from other ecological challenges that we face?
Yeah, when I was at Western, I was very interested I became very interested in Sarnia when I sort of learned about it. At first, I didn't really know it was there. But yeah, when I went to Sarnia, I was very struck by the idea that 62 petrochemical refineries could exist on both sides of the river, that this sort of spectacle of industrial capitalism could exist there. And for us in London, this was sort of the dragon's lair around the corner, right? It's this invisible absence that sort of oil always wants to be. And yet also at the same time, I mentioned, I visited Sarnia a few times. I had dear friends who live in Sarnia. I also was very cognizant that this is what sustains people's everyday lives, and that this is also at the same time a beautiful place to live, a place where people live rich, fulfilling lives. And in that way, it sort of became a parable for our times, right? Where it doesn't really matter where you live. I'm currently in Chibuktuk, Halifax, and there's a refinery around the corner from here as well.
Is there something about our current environment or way of life that blurs the line between reality and hallucination for you, for your writing?
For me, the way I look at my world, this line, there is no hard and fast, and particularly the way I write my fiction, there is no hard and fast line between reality and pressures that are put on reality. For me, that's just sort of how we experience. I try to articulate my fiction just sort of how we experience the world, right? For me, that's sort of what I'm trying to capture often in my fiction as I approach sort of cathartic and climactic moments. So I don't know how much of this has to do with environmental history. It'd be interesting to look a little farther back. I obviously think of Moby Dick, which is one of my sort of go-to primal fiction teachers. And, in that, I'm not so sure reality is really cut and dry in that book either. In fact, I would say it's not really.
The book is divided into two sections. The first section being named after the title story, Chemical Valley, and then the second after Dreamhaven. In your view, how do those two sections relate to one another? How do they work together or maybe play off one another?
Yes. So the second half of the book, Dreamhaven, is more thematically related than the first half. The first half is much more obviously drenched in oil, and sort of the characters interconnect, and it's it almost works like a linked short story collection. There's more linkages, characters interact with each other, etc., and it's all very deeply mired in petroleum. The second section moves away from Sarnia, sort of moves around different towns in southwestern Ontario, and one of the stories is set in Chicago as well. And it's more thematically linked, as I said, but the theme is chemicals, right? Every story, if you look into them, has certain chemical behaviors and certain strange chemical behaviors. For example, someone is a dentist accidentally injects somebody with Clorox, right? And just sort of we see the fallout of that as the dentist loses their job and becomes a doomsday prepper. So sort of looking more opaquely at the way that the petrochemical industry and also the chemical industry affects things like healthcare. So what it means to be lived. So that IVF patient, as you mentioned, in the story Dreamhaven, calls to mind just some of the nuances and difficulties and possibilities around what happens when we live in a world where something like IVF is possible, right? Some of the new ethical conundrums that emerge in that situation.
You also write poetry, and congratulations, you've won the Walrus Poetry Award. Can you tell me about your approach to that kind of different way of sharing language?
I sort of started with writing poetry, and that's where I learned the principles around the economy of language and the use of metaphor. Yeah, and I also think there's sort of a powerful connection between the short story as a genre and the poem. In that both can work on images, right? So you'll notice a lot of images in my stories if you read them. My stories work through metaphor, and they build momentum through parataxis, actually, so through the juxtaposition of images. There's a tendency, because they're both fiction, to compare the short story with the novel, but I think actually there might be more in common at times. The short story might almost be more like a narrative poem than it is like a condensed novel.